Hello, and welcome to Sake Revolution, America's first sake podcast. I'm your host, Timothy Sullivan. I'm a sake educator and brand ambassador, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website.
And I'm your other host, John Puma from the SakeNotes.com. I'm not a sake educator just yet, but I am New York's biggest sake nerd. And Tim, you know what's going on these days?
What's that?
COVID-19.
Oh, I heard
apparently what's going on.
I heard about that.
You did hear it. Okay. And that's why we're practicing social distancing and we're doing this over the internet, and you're at home and I'm at home.
Yes,
otherwise
we're Zooming.
we'd have to be at a table and have 6 feet between us.
We're Zoom bombing each other. I love that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so that's been crazy, huh?
It's a little weird.
How has this been affecting you, John?
Well, honestly, part of me wants to say that it doesn't affect me that much because I stay in a lot anyway. My day job is in IT. I drink a lot of sake. I'm inside a lot. But the reality is that not having the option of going out is something you miss. And also, I really miss going to my favorite restaurants. I miss going to my favorite sake bars. I miss seeing my friends not in a Zoom channel. I think that's something that we take for granted, is just like the human companionship.
Absolutely. I would say the same for me. My business as a brand ambassador has me traveling all over the country, flying out of New York all the time. And, as a natural introvert, there's part of me that is very happy being at home and kind of cocooning a little bit. But you do reach a point where you're like, wow, I haven't had some really good sushi or really good tempura in a long time. Home cooking only takes you so far. So I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. As I'm also a fellow introvert, which means that we charge up really nicely when we're at home, but then we don't have the place to go and expend that energy.
Absolutely. Well, I think one thing that you and I can both agree on is that we need sake to get through this situation. Don't you think?
I think, yes, plenty of sake, but learning as well.
Yes.
So before we get into the sake, what are we learning today anyway?
In today's Sake Education Corner, let's talk about sake's fifth ingredient. In our last episode, we talked about the 4 main ingredients in sake: rice, water, yeast, and koji. But you may know there is a 5th optional ingredient in sake, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, as I implied earlier, it wouldn't be Sake Revolution without some tastings. So we're going to be tasting sake together. Even though we're not in the same room, we're going to be tasting slightly different sakes, but we're going to be going around the same theme, right?
That's right. Yeah. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with our Sake Education Corner. So, John, there are 4 main ingredients in sake. Do you remember those from our previous episode?
Yes, it is water, rice, yeast, and koji. And at home, if you want to get a little bit more into that, that's episode 2 that you're going to be looking for.
That's right. So those 4 ingredients are required to make sake. If you don't have one of those, you cannot make sake. But according to the laws in Japan, there's one optional ingredient that you can legally add to sake. Do you know what that is?
That would be brewer's alcohol.
That's right. What is brewer's alcohol?
It's a distillate. It's a neutral spirit.
That's right. That's a great way to describe it. It's a neutral spirit. It's not going to impart any of its own flavor or aroma into the sake. And in Japanese, they call it brewer's alcohol. And it is usually the majority of brewers are going to be using a distillate of sugarcane.
Oh, so sugarcane.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's right.
All right.
So it's a very neutral spirit. And this gives us a situation where there's some sakes that use the 4 ingredients only, and some sakes that are fortified with this distilled alcohol. So at the highest level, every sake you ever drink in your whole life is going to fall into one of those 2 groups, either the fortified style alcohol added or the non-fortified. We call that the pure rice style. So we're going to be talking about the difference between those 2. And one of the things I really wanted to get to today is, why on earth are we doing this? Why would you want to add booze to booze? Why are you fortifying sake with distilled sugarcane? Any idea why are they doing this?
All right. So now I understand this is a stylistic choice because the addition of the brewer's alcohol will have an impact on aroma and kind of holding the aroma of the rice of the koji. But that robs me of the ability to make a joke where I say, "Oh, it has brewer's alcohol in it. Does that mean it's boozier?" Which is obviously not the case.
Well, that's a logical conclusion. Everyone thinks that if you add distilled alcohol, whenever I teach this in classes, people say, "Oh, you've added distilled alcohol. That type of sake must be boozier, must be higher in alcohol." But it's not. The reason it's not is because they add water to bring the alcohol level down at the time of bottling. But that's one. What you said is correct. That's one reason why you would add distilled alcohol. But there's actually 3 phases in history when brewers in Japan added alcohol to sake. For the first phase, we have to go way back in history to the Edo period, like early 1800s. And the reason that they added distilled alcohol to sake back in the Edo period, 1800s, was to help preserve the sake. This is before they really understood pasteurization as we do today. Sake was produced and shipped in wooden barrels, which are very porous and very prone to encouraging spoilage. And somehow they discovered that if they added rice shochu or distilled alcohol to sake at the end, it would help preserve it. It would spoil less often. And they didn't understand why, but they knew that if they did this step, it would help preserve the sake. So that was the first phase of adding alcohol. Then we move forward to the Second World War. And during the Second World War, do you know why they added distilled alcohol?
I think I do. I think that rice is a little harder to come by and they want to increase yields.
You got it. That's right. They could triple the amount of booze you could get out of a certain amount of rice by adding distilled alcohol. So during the Second World War, the Japanese government actually passed a law that required all sake to be fortified with distilled alcohol. It was
Really?
Yeah, it was required by law. And that allowed brewers to make a larger volume, and they did not use as much rice. Rice was in very short supply. People needed eating rice. There was rice shortages for eating, so they didn't want to waste rice on making sake, but they still wanted a lot of booze around, so they just decided to fortify. So the second wave of adding alcohol to sake was about producing greater volumes of sake. And that takes us to the third wave. So in modern times, after prosperity returned to Japan, they took that law off the books in the early 70s so they could make, again, the fortified and non-fortified styles. And what they discovered is that if they added a small amount of distilled alcohol to premium sake, they could coax out different textures, different flavors, and different aromas out of the sake. So you can really affect the mouthfeel, the aromatics, the texture of a sake. So based on all these hundreds of years of evolution, we've come to a point where some sakes are fortified and some are not. And
that's interesting.
For modern premium sake, the reason that some sakes are fortified, it's this, as you said at the beginning, it's a stylistic choice. Brewers can create more aromatics. They can round out any sharp edges in a sake. And that's one thing you want to know when you're tasting a sake. Is this a fortified style, the alcohol added style, or is this a pure rice style? And that will be a great jumping off point for exploring sake tastings.
You know, I've seen a lot of situations, mostly in Japan, where the pure rice nature of a given sake or a selection of sake is often accentuated. And I never quite understood like why it was coming off like it was hip to be pure rice. And I never quite understood it. And now seeing that like it's something that was literally it was illegal until the 70s to produce in that manner, that totally makes sense now. That like somebody who kind of got into sake during that era or started making sake during that era or learned about it would see a certain premium attached to making pure rice sake.
Yeah, one of the byproducts of that World War II era regulations about forcing people to add distilled alcohol to sake was that the alcohol added style sake kind of got a bad rap. You know, when you get into the 70s and, sake that is highly fortified with distilled alcohol can be made very cheaply and in large quantities.
So they were just like throwing a lot in just to get as much yield as they could out of it then, instead of thinking about what the flavor is going to be like.
Exactly. So it was kind of a quantity over quality situation.
That makes sense.
So when people think about alcohol added sake, there's some hangover, pardon the pun, there's some hangover from this mid 20th century regulations about adding a lot of distilled alcohol just to get more volume, kind of quality be damned. And when you get into the 80s and early 90s, there's this emergence of a new world of premium sake. And then they're using the distilled alcohol to create textures. And from a technical point of view, what's actually happening when you add the distilled alcohol to premium sake is that those alcohols that go in, they help dissolve additional rice that don't fall apart on their own. And this releases flavor and aroma compounds that won't be there in the non-alcohol added style, the pure rice style. So there's actually a technical reason behind adding the distilled alcohol. But you're right. A lot of people say to me, oh, well, adding alcohol, that's done, to create cheap, hot jet fuel. I don't want to drink that. But you know what I always say to that? John, have you ever heard of the annual sake competition that's in Japan? The government run.
Which one?
There's a annual sake competition that all the brewers submit a competition sake to the Japanese government. Mm-hmm. And a big percentage of the sakes, I think it's something like 85 or 90% of the sakes that are submitted to the competition are alcohol added styles. Huh. And that's because you can pull out aromas, you can pull out flavors using the small addition of distilled alcohol. And the brewers want to attract the attention of the judges, so they try to make their competition sakes as fragrant and showy as possible. So I always cite that as an example of how, this is the sake that the brewers are sending to the government to represent their skill, and it's an alcohol added style. So by no means does having an alcohol added sake mean it's bad jet fuel. It can create something that's fantastic.
I think that even I was, when I was first getting into sake, I was completely kind of, I don't want to say subjected to it, but I totally fell into that, where you hear, oh, this is the pure rice style, and you go like, pure is better, and you gravitate towards it. I want the pure stuff.
Yeah, pure sounds amazing.
And then this not this alcohol added thing, because when you don't understand exactly what that means, you assume yields, maybe you assume something strange. You assume they're just boozing it up a little bit, and that's a myth that we got to bust a little bit.
Yeah, and just for a little bit of context, about 70% of all the sake made in Japan falls into the alcohol added style. So the vast majority of what's produced in Japan falls into this alcohol added category. So
wow, 70%. That's crazy. Yep. I had no idea.
Yep. So it's a big...
Is that sake overall, or is that a premium sake?
That's sake overall.
Okay.
Yeah. So that includes table sake, entry level sake. But everything together, 70% is alcohol added and only 30% is not. So it's a big majority of what you would get in Japan. And for that reason, I think it's really important to understand. It's like really the foundation of the sake industry, this alcohol added style.
Nice. And what is we don't think we've got into it. What is the word for that?
Well, there is a word that refers to the alcohol added style in general, and it's called aruten, A-R-U-T-N. Aruten.
Okay.
And that's actually a contraction of a couple Japanese words.
Okay.
Aru stands for arukoru, or alcohol, And
Okay.
ten stands for tenka, which means to put in. So it's literally means like put in alcohol in a contracted form. Japanese love to take words and kind of contract them together. So aruten refers to alcohol added sake as a style.
Okay. That's interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah. And the pure rice style in Japanese, just so everyone knows that, that's called junmai. So junmai is an important word to know. Jun means pure, mai means rice. So it literally means pure rice, as we said before. So you have aruten and you have junmai. Those are the two main categories of sake. Every sake you ever drink in your whole life is going to go into one of those two categories.
Unfortunately, the bottle is rarely going to say aruten, but the bottle will almost always say junmai.
Yes. So it's a process of elimination. If the word
Yes,
junmai is not there,
setup.
if the word junmai is not on the bottle, then you can pretty much guarantee it's aruten or alcohol added.
Well, Tim, thank you. That was really enlightening. And so this is something that, like, when first getting into sake, it's something that throws a lot of people off. This is a very important thing to learn. But I think now that we're done going through that, it's time to drink. It's time to put this knowledge into practice.
Are we leaving the sake education corner?
We are leaving the sake education corner and we are going into the sake drinking foyer.
Okay. I am all for that.
Okay.
So, John and I both brought an example of an alcohol added sake to try today.
We did.
Wouldn't you know? Wouldn't you know? So, why don't you, John, tell us first, which sake did you bring to taste today?
Sure. I have the Uragasanru Koka, and that is a Honjozo from a brewery in Yamagata. This is now the third time I've had a Yamagata sake on this podcast, and in 3 episodes. And ladies and gentlemen, he has a type. And polishing rate on this guy is 65%, and the rice is a local Yamagata rice called Dewa no Sato.
All right. And the sake
and what do you have?
The sake that I have in front of me is from Hakai-san Sake Brewery. And full disclosure, this is the brand for which I am brand ambassador. This is also a Honjozo style sake. This has a rice milling rate of 55%. And 55.
Wow.
And the
nice.
Sake rice used, there's 2 different rices, Gohyaku Mangoku and Todori Kiwase. So there's 2 different rices used to make this. And the alcohol percentage is 15%.
Oh, my alcohol percentage is between 14 and 15.
All right.
It's evidence that adding the alcohol does not make it more alcoholic.
That's right. And the reason for that, again, is that when they bottle the sake, they add water to bring the alcohol percentage down. So the added alcohol is just for flavor, aroma, and texture. Just want to make it clear that John has the Uragasan Ryu, and I have the Hakai-san. And let's taste with John first. So John, let's go ahead and give it a taste, and let's see how that added alcohol affects the aroma and texture.
Well, so you'll have to take my word for it that I have a wine glass here, because on Sake Revolution, that is how we drink. Stemmed wine glass, which is a rarity in my household. And the first thing I'm noticing about this is that its aroma is beautiful. It's a very fresh, very light, very. It reminds me of kind of going outside after like the lawn's been mowed, and maybe that's some of the social isolation talking. I'm yearning for that right now, but it does. It just is that fresh, clean scent, that aroma that comes from that being outside, and that, like fresh cut grass, some fruitiness to it, very light. And that's the aroma.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it really does smell good.
That's very much in line with Yamagata style, right?
Yeah.
It's just kind of these gorgeous aromas. Yeah.
So this reminds me an awful lot of some of the other Yamagata sakes that we've had on the show. I think most recently and I don't want to do too much of a throwback here, but most recently we had the Kudoki Jozu, or Good at Flirting, or Mac Daddy, and that was a very, very fruity sake with but also very a little bit light. Whereas this has a really luxurious mouthfeel. It is still fruity. It is not nearly as fruity, but there is just there's a coating of your mouth with it, and it just lets you really savor that flavor, and it's wonderful.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. So the previous sake you mentioned, the Kudoki Jozu, that's a Junmai style. That's no added alcohol. And those styles tend to be a little bit crisper. And this one, you noticed very correctly, is going to coat your palate a little bit more. And that's where that added alcohol texture comes in. So you're getting a little bit more of a richness, right? A little bit more coating, a little bit more texture. I call it a roundness.
Yeah. It's sacrificing the overt fruitiness. It's less of that, and it is so much more of a textural adventure, an experience. And I think that having that feeling of it just coating your mouth lets it linger a lot longer, and it's a very pleasant linger. Like you want this, you want to continue to taste this for as long as you can. It's very nice.
Yep. So those are things that people often say for premium sake. You've added distilled alcohol, you can heighten aromas, you can round out textures, and you can lengthen the finish. So I think those are all things that are coming through for you with this alcohol added sake you have.
I think if I had this blindly, I would not immediately guess that this was a Honjozo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a little bit more luxurious than that typically is.
Yeah, so it sounds like this is a poster child sake for a really high-end, added alcohol, easy drinking sake.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Yeah. All right, well, let's take a look at mine. This, again, is the Hakai-san Honjozo. And I happen to know from being brand ambassador for this brand that this, in the Japanese market, this Honjozo is the best-selling sake from our brewery. So we sell more of this than anything else in the Japanese market.
Must be doing something right then.
Yeah. So I'm using my wine glass as well. Okay. Now the aromas I'm getting on the Hakai-san from Niigata are very different from what you've described. I'm getting a little bit of a raw rice aroma, a little bit of gently steamed rice, maybe rice husk, and it's more overall kind of ricey and grainy, but in a very, very gentle, kind of like a whisper of rice. If you have rice stored in your cupboard and you open up the rice container before you cook the rice, there's an aroma of raw rice that you get. And that is often something I refer to when I talk about aromatics in certain sakes, and I'm really getting that here. The other aroma note I wanted to mention that people sometimes get in sake is lactic acid. So do you know what lactic acid is? It's what you smell when you smell milk, butter. It's those creamy dairy lactic aromas. And we use lactic acid to make sake as well. And there's sometimes lactic acid produced naturally during the fermentation process. So I get just a hint of a little bit of a lactic character here as well. So no fruits, kind of zero fruitiness, ricey aromas, just a hint of a lactic aroma, but overall very restrained. Niigata's kind of very well known for having these super restrained aromatics. So light, really, really gentle. So that's what I've got for the aroma. And let's give it a taste. Okay, so the first thing I noticed is that I'm getting that palate coating texture as well immediately. It feels much more round. It feels like it's sticking to the roof of my mouth and on my tongue and all around. It's a very palate coating type of texture, and very, very clean flavors. overall dry impression and a really crisp finish, which I think is a little bit different from what you
Very
experienced in yours. Yeah, this Niigata style is also about restrained aroma, but also really clean finishes are quite common. So this is super clean, super crisp, disappears right away. And that's, I think, a stylistic difference between Yamagata and Niigata prefectures.
Right. You mentioned the riciness of it. And when I think of Niigata sake, that's often a profile that pops into my head as like, oh, very ricey stuff.
I think if you talk to the average Japanese person on the street, you tap them on the shoulder and you ask them, what's Niigata famous for? 99% of them would say rice. So there's an impression that Niigata is the home of the highest quality rice. The most expensive eating rice you can buy in Japan is grown in Niigata. Yes, absolutely. And so there's a impression, and I think a self-identity in Niigata region with the flavor of rice and how important rice is. So that really comes through. And the really clean finish, there's a lot of snow in Niigata, and I always think about that snow melt water, really crisp stream water. I feel like you get that really crisp finish. It reminds me of the snow melt mountain stream water too. Just absolutely delicious, but delicious in a different way from yours, I think.
Yeah, I am actually a fan of the Hokkaisan Honjozo. It is available at a ramen shop that I love to go to, that I'm very much missing right now. And I always order that sake with my ramen. Every time. I think that for some reason it just really goes well. It's a like a tonkotsu ramen, not like a shoyu ramen or anything like that. Yeah. And for some reason I just think that Honjozo really it like lightens up wonderfully. It gets a little bit fruity and compared to the rich broth. It's just so interesting.
I think that's a great pairing, and one of the reasons when I sell Hokkaisan sake around the country and I'm in a ramen restaurant, I often recommend Honjozo. And the reason I think it works so well is because ramen tends to be a little bit of a fatty broth. You sometimes see oil floating on the surface of your ramen. And the crisp, dry nature of this sake, that really crisp finish, I think cuts through that fat really well and cleanses the palate. So when you take another slurp of your ramen, you get a fresh hit of flavor because you've cleansed your palate using the Honjozo sake. So dry, clean sakes have that palate cleansing aspect to them that I think is fantastic. My favorite pairing with this Honjozo, I actually like it with yakitori as well. All right. So yakitori is the charcoal grilled chicken on a stick, a little bit of a smoky flavor, a little bit of a charcoal flavor, lots of salt, and it's absolutely delicious. And I find that when you nibble on different parts of the chicken, sometimes you get organ meat, sometimes you get thigh, sometimes you get, all different parts of the chicken. Sometimes it's better, don't ask, don't tell, who knows what you're getting. But I find that the same situation, the dry, clean Honjozo, it can stand up to that salt, but it also cleanses your palate too. So when you're ready to move on to vegetables, or a lot of yakitori places finish with some homemade chicken broth, it's just so fantastic to have that after a nice dry sake, I find.
Lovely.
That's making me hungry.
We brought this on ourselves.
Yes. So what about pairings for your sake?
This one's tough.
Ura
it's tough because it has that coating of the mouth that is a little bit, it's still a little bit fruity and stands up really well on its own. I'd say a lot like the other Yamagata sakes that we've talked about, is I wouldn't want to do something to this it's still very delicate. And I think that a strong flavor would really upset the balance. So I would not want to have this I would not want this anywhere near my ramen, because it would just taste like ethanol. I think it would just get blown away.
Yeah, agreed.
But something light, something I kind of think I would want to have this, maybe a little salmon.
Yeah, that sounds good. I was just, what popped into my mind, I've had the sake you're drinking, I've had that before myself. And, when you have a salad, Sometimes they use like a raspberry vinaigrette, or they put little slices of fruit in a salad, and you have that little citrus or that little fruity component in a salad. I really love that with the more aromatic, fruity sakes, because I find it picks up on that fruitiness a little bit.
I think I've got some homework now.
I mean, when I'm at a place with all the different salad dressing options, I usually don't go for the ranch, although I love those with French fries. But, you know, if you give me a good raspberry vinaigrette, I think that's fantastic. I really choose that a lot. And it lends just this hint of fruitiness to a salad or something that might be a little bitter, a little boring, and brings in just a touch of sweetness. And I find that pairs really well with sakes like the Uraga Sanryu.
All right. Well, the next time I'm allowed to go someplace, I'm going to try that. Remember going places? That was nice. One day it's going to happen again, folks. We will be free someday.
We will.
But this is it is. Yes. I don't want to make light of it. This is a very important thing that all of us are doing right now. And it's, you know, you may be healthy, and you may be in a situation where, you know, maybe getting this virus wouldn't hurt you, but you're doing it for the people around you, for people you may run into on the street. Stay inside, guys.
Yep. And I think, you know, in being serious for a second, I think this is really going to change our society in a lot of ways. This is really an event that the whole world is going through at the same time. And that, you know, hasn't really happened at this level. This really affects almost everybody in the world. And it's really, I think it'll change the way we interact. I think we're going to do a lot more online in the future. And this might be our first step for our online podcast meetings.
Yes. All right. So on that note, I think maybe we want to wrap this up.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you have a chance, please take a moment and rate our podcast on Apple Podcasts. That'll help us out a lot.
It really does. And to ensure that you don't miss an episode, please subscribe to wherever you download your podcasts. We're there on Apple Podcasts. We're there on Stitcher. You know, pretty much any place that you are going to look for podcasts, you're going to find us.
And to learn more about any of the topics or sakes that we talked about in today's episode, be sure to visit our show notes or simply visit sakerevolution.com.
And if you've got feedback for us or you have ideas for what we can do in future shows, send that information over to feedback@sakerevolution.com.
So until next time, remember to keep drinking sake and kanpai!